In this presentation, we will discuss physiology of lung protection, and we will focus mainly on volumetrauma and oxygen toxicity. I have nothing to disclose in this presentation, and I have two main objectives. At the end of this presentation, you will understand the strategy of lung recruitment and protection. Also, you will understand assessment of lung volume and consequences of volumetrauma and oxygen toxicity. Just a quick reminder about respiratory volumes. We discussed before in the previous presentation that the residual volume is the volume remaining in the lung, even if the lung is totally collapsed. And another volume on top of the residual volume, which is the expiratory reserve volume, both of them making the functional residual capacity. So the lung should be recruited at the functional residual capacity. And this volume is a target to be recruited and optimized for any lung protection strategy. Breathing above that is a tidal volume, also should be optimized. But breathing within the functional residual capacity or below the optimum level of the functional residual capacity, that might end in atelectotrauma. So even if you provide adequate tidal volume, but the lung is recruited below the optimum volume of functional residual capacity, this is considered as atelectotrauma and might lead to prolonged atelectasis, might limit alveolization, and will end up by lung trauma, prolonged lung trauma, and predisposed to chronic lung disease. At the same time, hyperinflation of the lung above the level of the functional residual capacity. So if you are inflating the lung by higher heat than the physiologic heat needed to optimize the lung at the functional residual capacity, and the lung now is exceeding that with significant hyperinflation, this might lead to barotrauma of the lung, even if you consider the tidal volume is a physiologic tidal volume. Okay. Now, even if the lung recruited at the functional residual capacity, but you are applying a very high tidal volume above the physiologic tidal volume, that might end in volumetrauma. So I think now we understand the difference between barotrauma and volumetrauma. Barotrauma, when you apply too much pressure, trying to recruit the lung and recruiting the lung beyond the functional residual capacity. And the lung is hyperinflated at the end of expiration. And then if you apply tidal volume more than the physiologic tidal volume, that might lead to volumetrauma. And both of them are very bad, but we'll realize later that volumetrauma is even more dangerous than barotrauma. Barotrauma mainly might result in decreased venous return or decreased cardiac output, so can be detected clinically earlier. But volumetrauma might be clinically silent and might end up by significant lung damage. So now let us discuss in this important slide the strategy of lung recruitment. Again, atelectasis means lung volume, overall volume at the end of expiration below the functional residual capacity level. So the lung volume is only at the residual volume. You need to recruit the lung, so you need to optimize up to the functional residual capacity. By doing that, you are helping the lung to recover from the lung atelectasis, and you will improve the chances of alveolization. Derecruitment of the lung means the lung is back to the residual volume or lung atelectasis. So it means worsening of the lung recruitment or loss of functional residual capacity. Once you recruit the lung to the functional residual capacity, you need to stabilize that. So don't rush and wean the pressure, the PEEP or mean airway pressure over a short period of time. For how long? It might be 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. Typically in chronic cases, at least 3 days. But there is no like certain period that you should consider for stabilization with the same pressure to maintain the functional residual capacity. You need to monitor on daily basis oxygenation, not only the oxygen saturation, but oxygen histograms, blood gases, and the ventilation parameters, the hemodynamics, the 3 parameters that we discussed in the previous presentation, to monitor continuously to be sure that the lung is recruited very well with optimum oxygenation, optimum ventilation. There is no over-oxygenation or over-ventilation or under-ventilation. And with the lung inflation, there is no any compromise of the venous return by monitoring of the hemodynamics. So stabilization, once we have stabilization of all of that, then you may consider weaning cautiously. And while weaning, you have to be sure that all of the 3 monitored parameters, oxygenation, ventilation, and hemodynamics, are maintained within normal values, and the lung still maintained within the functional residual capacity. So continue weaning as far as all of these parameters maintained. But while weaning, or for example, if you consider extubation of a ventilated infant and the lung is back to the stage of atelectasis or back to the residual volume, then you have to restart again and recruit the lung as soon as you realize that the lung is atelectatic. So with any kind of worsening while weaning, you have to go one step back and maintain the lung inflation and the functional residual capacity. And you need to reassess and investigate the reason why the lung or the patient did not respond to the weaning process. It could be underlying infection or inflammation or undernutrition. So you need to optimize all of the factors that might be contributed to adequate lung development and recruitment. Now let us summarize the 5 main objectives of applying protective lung strategies. While applying any lung recruitment strategy or mechanical ventilation strategy, you need to be sure that you apply pathophysiology specific strategy. For example, in case of high resistance or high airway resistance, there's different strategy from for compliance. Ventilation of RDS or infant with significant TDN is different from ventilation of pulmonary aspiration or chronic lung disease. Ventilation early in life is different from ventilation later on, older kids beyond the postnatal transition. Second, select the most gentle mode consistent with the strategy. So if you are able to recruit the lung with non-invasive mode, it's better than intubation and invasive mechanical ventilation. And if the patient is requiring higher tidal volume and to avoid volutrauma, you may consider shifting the infant to high frequency, either high frequency oscillator or high frequency jet ventilation, which is only available in North America. Avoid atelectotrauma. It's very important, again, to recruit the lung with a functional residual capacity to avoid atelectotrauma. Avoid hemodynamic instability, which might occur in both atelectasis and hyperinflation. With atelectasis, it might induce pulmonary hypertension or high pulmonary vascular resistance. The same situation in hyperinflation. It might induce increased pulmonary vascular resistance, and it might actually impact the venous return and the cardiac output. You need to avoid both hypoxia and hyperoxia and the fluctuation between both. So once you have any infant on oxygen requirement more than 50%, you need to try to recruit the lung and bring the FiO2 back. The target fraction oxygen, inspired fraction oxygen is below 30%. If you have the oxygen requirement is increasing, you have to sort out what is the reason, and you have to recruit the lung properly. So you need to optimize the lung inflation, use the pressure, non-invasive pressure, or mechanical ventilation pressure to wean the oxygen as much as you can down to the lowest level possible. So the priority to increase the pressure, to be able to wean the oxygen, not to give extra oxygen to avoid to increase the pressure. So we have a case scenario for that. To clarify the idea, preterm infant born at 23 weeks and now post-menstrual age 36 weeks and still on mechanical ventilation. So this infant now is we see affected with chronic lung disease and or bronchopulmonary dysplasia, 36 weeks and still on mechanical ventilation. He's currently on high frequency jet ventilation and he's requiring oxygen up to 70%, even after the oxygen reduction test, up to 100%. And when we tried to apply the oxygen reduction test, we were able only to reach a minimum of 70% FiO2. PEEP of 14, PIP of 33, and mean airway pressure of 17. It's really high. And on oxygen histograms, as you can see here, the range of saturation above 95 was 10%, 90 to 95, 20%, 85 to 89, 52%, 84 to 80, 10%, and below 80% saturation was 8% out of 24 hours. So the percent between brackets, as you know from the oxygen histograms, is the percent of time over 24 hours. And 1% is equal to 15 minutes. As you can see, the X-ray is showing significant lung collapse or atelectasis, so typical loss of functional reservoir capacity. I cannot even differentiate the heart from both lungs. So we recruited the lung with applying PEEP, stepwise PEEP test, and we increased PEEP from 14 up 15, 16, we reached 17. And while increasing the peak end expiratory pressure, we were able to wean the oxygen down to 30%. And shortly after we started weaning the PEEP back to 15, the FiO2 increased. And by then we understand that this infant really required that high pressure 17. So we increased the pressure back to 17. And this X-ray on people with 17, you can realize significant still chronic lung disease, but it is better than the previous X-ray anyway. You can also, if you have the infant on conventional ventilation, you can look at the pressure volume curve. So you have this infant on a PEEP of 15, and the pressure volume curve is more vertical, and you have reasonable dynamic compliance. It's 2.65, and the infant was around 1.5 kilograms. The normal compliance between 1 to 2 ml per centimeter water per kg. You have resistance here, 48, which is reasonable. You have time constant around 0.12. You have to be sure that the eye time is adjusted to be at least 3 times the time constant. So looking at the pressure volume curve will give you an idea about the lung recruitment. So although the infant is requiring high pressure, high PEEP, but the lung compliance improved with that pressure. You can also do lung ultrasound, and lung ultrasound is only helpful for assessment of lung atelectasis. And probably if you attended lung ultrasound course before, you know that we can score the lung up to 4 different scores. The first score of 0 when you have just dominant A lines, and there is no significant B lines, so you have a good aeration of the lung. If you have more than 2, 3 or more longitudinal B lines, you have interstitial fluid and you give a score of 1. You have white out lung, you give a score of 2. And when you see predominant white out lung plus air bronchogram, you give a score of 3, which is the maximum score. So you can assess the lung ultrasound scoring before and after intervention. The limitation of the lung ultrasound cannot assess hyperinflation, because hyperinflation you can just realize from predominant A lines, which is good aeration. Could be hyperinflation or could be just good aeration. And the maximum score, we are evaluating 6 lung zones. So the maximum score is 18. So 3 zones in each side. 6 multiplied by maximum of 3, you get maximum score of 18. Another dynamic feature of the ultrasound, you can look at the ultrasound clip, and you can realize here that the A lines appear and disappear. It means during inspiration, you have more aeration, and during expiration, the lung collapses, which means your recruitment of the lung more during expiration. When you ask or do shift X-ray, you have only one frame. It could be at the end of expiration, it could be expiratory film or inspiratory film. But the lung ultrasound is dynamic. You can see the lung recruitment or the lung movement during breathing. So if the lung collapses at the end of expiration, you will see different score from moment to moment. It means the infant's breathing with more A lines, and then the lung collapses at the end of expiration. You have white out lung at the end of expiration, means the lung de-recruited. So you need to apply more PEEP in this situation. Also, you can look at the oxygen histograms, very helpful to look at the oxygen histograms. As you can see here, you have 5 bars, and each bar is representing the range of oxygen saturation. And above the bar, you have the percent, which is the percent of time over 24 hours or over the period of time assessment. For this infant, you have significant all over the place. You have above 95, really significant percent of time, and below 80%, you have 10%, which is also significant, up to the A lines. Impaired filling, which will lead to significant decrease of pressure and radiography post-lung recruitment output. For this infant, you have significant all over the place. You have above 95, really significant percent of time, and below 80%, you have 10%, which is also significant percent of time. For the saturation below 80, which is the definition of hypoxemia. After lung recruitment, you can now realize the difference, only 7% above the target saturation and 0% below 80% saturation, so significant improvement. Also, you can do echocardiography post-lung recruitment if you are not sure about the hyperinflation or to rule out hyperinflation. With hyperinflation, you can recognize empty heart. In case of hyperpulmonary vascular resistance or pulmonary hypertension, the left side will be more empty compared to right side. Right side will stay dilated, as in this four-chamber view here. Still, you can realize severe impaired filling of the left heart compared to right heart. In this image, you have severely impaired filling of both left ventricle and right ventricle, signifying significant impaired filling, which will lead to significant decrease in cardiac output. So low filling volume can be a consequence of high minimal pressure. So you need to decrease the pressure and check the echocardiography again. So echocardiography is very helpful for assessment of hyperinflation, which might affect the venous return and the cardiac output. But actually, the most reliable way to assess the physiologic lung inflation, optimum lung inflation, is to assess the transpulmonary pressure. We described it before, like the physiology of transpulmonary pressure. It is a pressure inside the lung minus the pressure outside the lung, which should be positive to keep the lung inflated. Once you have the transpulmonary pressure less than zero, it means the lung is de-recruited or collapsed. You need to apply more pressure. To do that, you need to apply a catheter, esophageal catheter, as you can see here. And this catheter is staying in the lower part of the esophagus with the inflated balloon and very sensitive to the pressure inside the mediastinum, which is reflecting the pleural pressure. So if we know the mean air pressure and the outside pressure, which is the mediastinal pressure or the pleural pressure, the machine can calculate the transpulmonary pressure easily. But let us explain that in this experiment. Very interesting experiment. Let me explain the idea first. So we have artificial lung in the middle of this bubble, and we are measuring or applying PEEP to keep this artificial lung inflated. At the same time, we are monitoring the pressure outside the lung, which assumed to be the same in human, like mediastinal pressure. So to keep the lung inflated, the pressure outside should be equal to the pressure inside, not exceeding or not very significantly lower than the pressure inside the lung. So the optimum to be around zero, the transpulmonary pressure, the transmural pressure. So let us apply this experiment to understand the concept. So regardless how much pressure we apply, to keep the lung inflated, this pressure should be equal the pressure outside the lung. So let us start with applying 6 PEEP. So we have the PEEP set at 6 and the mediastinal pressure, the pressure outside the lung, set at 6 as well. So 6 and 6. So we have the normal inflation of the lung. There is no collapse. And then let us increase the pressure outside the lung to 12. So the PEEP is still at 6, but the pressure outside the lung is 12 now. You can see the lung, artificial lung now is collapsed, totally collapsed. So 6 minus 12 is minus 12, minus 6. The result should be at least 0 to maintain the lung inflated. If we now increase PEEP to 12 to be equal to the pressure outside, so increase PEEP to 12. Now you get the lung inflated again. So you have 12 minus 12, you have the transmural pressure back to 0. So you have now the lung inflated. And the breathing is still normal, blood volume is still normal, but the lung stayed inflated at the end of expiration. Now let us increase the pressure outside the lung to 20. So we have the PEEP 12, but the pressure outside is 20. The mediastinal pressure is 20. Again, the lung will be collapsed. But if we increase the pressure, the PEEP pressure to 20, so 20 minus 20, the transmural pressure back to 0, we'll get the lung back inflation at the same volume. As the same volume that was before. So when you have the PEEP of 6 and mediastinal pressure of 6, you have the same volume. PEEP of 20 and mediastinal pressure of 20, you have the same lung volume inflation. Let us do one more thing. Keep the PEEP at 20 by decrease the mediastinal pressure to 6. So do the opposite thing. Decrease the pressure outside the lung to 6. Now you see the lung is hyperinflated, significantly inflated, because now you have significantly the PEEP exceeding the mediastinal pressure. 20 minus 6 is plus 12. It should be 0 or just slightly above 0. I think we understand now, regardless how much pressure we apply, it is about the transmural pressure. And this transmural pressure will be affected by the lung compliance and also the mediastinal pressure. If we are talking about sick infants, it's typically the lung compliance. So whatever pressure you apply, it will be translated into volume according to the compliance. So here you got the same volume as PEEP of 6, but if you increase the pressure outside or you decrease the compliance, we need much higher pressure. It can be up 20, PEEP of 20, and you will get the same volume inflation. So this fact is very important to understand. The pressure you apply, the pressure will be attenuated and lost by the poor lung compliance. You are dealing with poor lung compliance. It is about how much volume we get at the end. That's why you may see very premature infant with very poor compliance might require PEEP of 15 or sometimes 20. I'm talking about premature infants with chronic lung disease, not first day of life. And that's because the lung compliance is very poor. With applying the esophageal catheter or balloon, as we described before, you can get the esophageal pressure here. And if you have the transmural pressure, here you have the curve of the transmural pressure. During expiration, it is below 0. Means the lung is derecruited. You have to bring this curve up. So you have to increase PEEP. Now we have PEEP of 5 or 6, and you need to increase that because you have your transmural pressure minus 2. Should be 0 or slightly above 0. And then after the PEEP increased to 10 or 11, you have the transmural pressure is around 1.6, slightly above 0. So now you have the lung recruited, well recruited. Until now, we don't have approval to use a transmural pressure or the esophageal balloon in neonates. It's still experimental. But it has been tested and has been in use for adult mechanical ventilation for some time. So you have to consider higher PEEP whenever the lung is derecruited. Regardless how much pressure needed, you need to recruit the lung back to the functional residual capacity. So you have to get rid of your hypophobia. And remember that volutrauma is much more important than barotrauma. And based on the experiment done before, lung trauma and injury, which indeed don't occur if the transpulmonary pressure is maintained within safe limits, 0 or just slightly above 0, no matter how high mean air pressure or alveolar pressure are. In 1988, Dreyfus et al. Showed that lesional pulmonary edema occurs in paralyzed healthy animals during a pressure control ventilation with high tidal volume and airway pressure, but not in those ventilated with similar airway pressure with low tidal volume. So when you apply high pressure, like high PEEP, with very high tidal volume, the lung lesion is much higher than infant with high pressure, but with lower tidal volume. So the volutrauma is more dangerous than barotrauma, as proved in animal studies. So let's simplify that again. We have the esophageal manometer with the pressure at 10, and you have the lung inflation at the end of expiration, PEEP of 10. So you have 10 minus 10, you have lung inflation, the function is zero capacity. So you have 25 ml lung inflation here without any compression of the mediastinal structures. But if you have another example of the mediastinal pressure or pleural pressure at 10, and you have the PEEP of only 7, so the lung is derecruited or just add the residual volume 15 ml. So you have 7 minus 10, you have minus 3. Again, the transpulmonary or transmural pressure should be 0 or slightly above the 0. But if you have too much pressure, keep exceeding too much the mediastinal pressure, you have 20, for example, 20 PEEP, and you have only 10 esophageal pressure or mediastinal pressure. So you have 20 minus 10, you have plus 10. So you have significant lung inflation exceeding the functional zero capacity or almost reaching the total lung capacity, and with a significant compression of the venous return and the blood vessels within the chest cavity. Now let us discuss the complications of hyperoxia. In this experiment done long time ago, 1930, animal experiment, was nitrogen washed out by applying 100% oxygen, pure oxygen for inhalation in animals for a long time. Nitrogen concentration decreased in more easily removable nitrogen organs like gray matter of the brain. Remember, we have in our body, and we have almost 570 millimeter mercury of nitrogen in our blood, which is equivalent to the atmospheric nitrogen. When you apply 100% oxygen for a long time, the consequences will be lung collapse, as we described before, but at the same time, the body will be at a negative nitrogen balance. And organs like gray matter of the brain reaching nitrogen, the balance might be negative. So the oxygen on long run might affect the brain development. Some antagonistic action might occur, such as constriction of the blood vessels of the brain. He described that very long time ago, and this is actually proven recently by applying near-field spectroscopy. When you apply near-field spectroscopy to the brain, in infant with 100% oxygen, and we have that in one of the clinical scenarios recorded in a different section in this conference, the oxygen extraction of the brain is significantly decreased with applying 100% oxygen, signifying the toxic effect of the oxygen on the other organs, not only the lung, on brain, on other organs. Now we'll discuss another issue that might be really common in sick infants on mechanical ventilation. in particular infant with severe VQ mismatch and significant intrapulmonary right to left shunt. What's expected to happen with crying? Crying might worsen the VQ mismatch and increase right to left shunt in two ways. Crying will increase resistance and decrease in inspiratory-expiratory ratio, which will cause overdistension of the most compliant alveoli. As you can see here, the compliant or relatively healthy compliant alveoli might overdistend with the crying, and this overdistension might compress the capillaries and might cause significant decrease of blood flow, like a dead space as we described before. At the same time, crying might worsen distension or recruitment of the weak alveoli. So the weak alveoli will become more collapsed, causing more right-left shunt. So we have two bad consequences with agitation and crying for sick infants on mechanical ventilation requiring high minor pressure due to significant VQ mismatch. Overdistension of the relatively healthy alveoli with compression of the capillaries, and also deflation of the weak alveoli and increased right-left shunt. And that has been documented in research. In this article about mechanisms of breathing during sneezing or crying in premature infants. With crying, the expectation could be one or more of the following: increased pulmonary resistance 4 times due to overdistension of the relatively healthy alveoli and the decrease of the blood flow. Decrease compliance by about 50%, decrease respiratory rate, and decrease in expiratory ratio, which will become 1:5 ratio in respiratory to expiratory time. This may lead to decrease in VQ ratio and significant right to left shunt. And as you know, the significant right to left shunt, the saturation will drop, and even higher oxygen will not help to get the saturation back to normal. Now we'll discuss in this comprehensive slide the physiologic-based ventilation strategies. Just to give you a quick and easy approach idea how to select between invasive and non-invasive ventilation. And you need to ask yourself a few questions about breathing. If the infant is breathing normally without significant, on the other end here, apnea or periodic breathing, that's very important to consider when you select between non-invasive and invasive ventilation. Also, the degree of VQ mismatch and right left shunt reflected on mean airway pressure. If the mean airway pressure less than 10, oxygen less than 55% required oxygen, and carbon dioxide less than 65 milliliter mercury, in this situation, you may consider non-invasive ventilation, CPAP, or non-invasive ventilation can be considered, and increase CPAP pressure to get the lowest FiO2. So if the infant is requiring higher than 30%, and if you increase the pressure and if you are able to wean the oxygen down, then you need to select the higher pressure, because again, the oxygen is toxic, more toxic than higher pressure. And as we mentioned before, with poorly compliant lung, the pressure that you will apply will be lost or attenuated within the poorly compliant lung. So that pressure will not be reaching the mediastinum, because if the lung is poorly compliant, then the volume that you will get from high pressure is a small volume, relatively small. Then if the infant is breathing, but he's requiring mean air pressure more than 10, or oxygen more than 35, or carbon dioxide in the blood gas more than 65, you may need to shift to non-invasive ventilation and apply lung recruitment to get again the lowest possible FiO2. If the infant is apneic or with periodic breathing and frequently apneic, again, if the mean air pressure is still less than 10, the mean air pressure could be non-invasive, could be the CPAP pressure. So CPAP of 8 or 9 is considered as mean air pressure of 8 or 9. FiO2 less than 35% and CO2 still less than 65 milliliter mercury. In this situation, you have to consider apnea of prematurity might be the contributing factor, especially if the infant is responsive to caffeine. You may increase the dose of the caffeine or give extra mini load or a small less than the full load of caffeine, for example 5 milligram per kg. And if the infant is responsive, it is confirming that the apnea is related to prematurity. Or it could be feeding intolerance, like MSs. In this situation, bradycardia desaturation will be associated at the same time with periodic breathing. For apnea prematurity, the apnea should happen first, followed by bradycardia and desaturation. For feeding intolerance, it is more vagal stimulation, so we have bradycardia at the same time with apnea or the desaturation. And it is usually responsive to continuous feeding and might not respond or might worsen actually with caffeine. And then if you check lung ultrasound score, which is really helpful in our unit to differentiate between derecruited lung as a reason for frequent apneas or periodic breathing compared to apnea prematurity. So if the lung ultrasound score is high, definitely if the lung ultrasound score more than 8, then you may need to apply more descending pressure, try higher CPAP or higher PEEP if the infant shift to mechanical ventilation. In the situation when you have periodic breathing or apnea and the infant is requiring mean air pressure more than 10, FiO2 more than 35%, and carbon dioxide more than 65 in the blood gas, likely this infant will require. Now we came to the conclusions of our presentation. The first conclusion, lung protection starts with recruiting functional residual capacity regardless the pressure needed. In poorly compliant lung, you may need to get too much pressure to get the lung inflated to the functional residual capacity. And you need to do that. Otherwise, the lung will be left atelectatic and the end result will be atelectotrauma, which could affect significantly alveolization and lung development. Monitoring during and after lung recruitment is important to avoid lung trauma. And we have 3 main types of lung trauma. If you give too much PEEP or mean air pressure, you will get orotrauma. If you give volume or tidal volume more than the physiologic tidal volume, you will get volutrauma, which is more dangerous compared to barotrauma based on the animal studies. If you leave the lung without recruitment at the residual volume, then you will get atelectotrauma. So you need to avoid the 3 types of trauma. Monitoring should include oxygenation, oxygen histograms on daily basis, monitoring partial pressure of oxygen in the blood gases and calculating oxygenation index or oxygen saturation index if you don't have blood gases, monitoring of ventilation, all of the parameters that you can get from the ventilator, the compliance, resistance, time constant. All of these parameters are very important. And also monitoring the CO2, either in tidal CO2 or monitoring partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood gases, monitoring hemodynamics, blood pressure, particularly the pulse pressure from the monitor, to be sure that the descending pressure, the pressure that you apply, particularly keep or minor pressure, does not affect the venous return or cardiac output. Then lung protection is to recruit the lung to the functional residual capacity and decrease at the same time oxygen toxicity. And the priority to recruit the lung, even if the infant is requiring higher pressure, the priority to give the pressure as far as you are able to wean the oxygen down. And your target FiO2 is below 30%. Unless you increase the pressure and there is no improvement and the FiO2 is still high, like 40, 45, or 50, then you should just watch and try a different strategy and roll out other mechanisms of hypoxemia like pulmonary hypertension. But as far as you are increasing the pressure and you are able to wean the oxygen by lung recruitment, and they will show you that in a different presentation, then you have to continue that. So the priority to get the oxygen down to avoid the oxygen toxicity, the FiO2 down as much as you can. Okay, thank you very much.